Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining the Nonprofit Learning Lab for today's workshop. If you have any questions along the way for our presenter, you can type them into the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel, likely on the right-hand side of your screen. If you have any tech questions, you can also type them there. If you are interested in receiving the recordings and materials from today's free webinar, you can visit our free webinars page on the Nonprofit Learning Lab website, or you could send us an email at program@nonprofitlearninglab.org. And without further ado, I will now hand it over to you, Brian.
Hi, thank you so much. And thanks to the Nonprofit Learning Lab for giving me the opportunity to talk to you all today. My name is Brian Loevner. I'm the founder and president of BLVE Consults. And my consulting firm has focused most of its attention over the last 3 years on organizational life cycle in the nonprofit world. And specifically, we're going to talk about organizational life cycle in times like we're in now, which are times of pretty significant change for the nonprofit sector. So, what is life cycle in the nonprofit world? The simplest way to talk about it is that it is like everything else. It has a beginning, it has a middle, it has an end. Some organizations, nonprofit organizations, can last for 100 or 200 years, others for 20, others for 5 years. But they all have a beginning, a middle, and an end, like any good story. And it's important for us to understand that as leaders in the nonprofit world. It's important. Why is it important? Because in this moment, when our communities are changing so significantly and how our communities want to be served is changing so significantly, our organizations, our nonprofits, have to change and adapt to their needs. We may not be able to go back to the status quo, to what we've been doing before. In some cases, some of that may work. In other cases, it won't. And we need to find new ways to serve our communities. And every organization should consider it. And the reasons for why are common sense, right? As organizational leaders, we need to always be looking towards the emergent future of our organization and the emergent needs of our community. And if we're not doing that, then we're doing a disservice to our community, because particularly in this moment where we are, if you'll, post quote pandemic or current endemic, whichever way you want to look at it, we are in a situation where our communities are still trying to figure out how they want to be served, how they want to be engaged. Organizations that do forward-facing public programs, ones where they serve the public in person, those programs are changing very significantly even in this moment. So every organization should be considering where are they in their current life cycle, and how can they best serve their community and shift their life cycle to do that. Okay, exercise time. Everybody ready? Everybody take 30 seconds and think about one transformation that your organization could make. Okay, and this is a significant transformation. Like, think of it as we could partner with another organization. We could serve a different community in a different location. We could completely shift our mission to serving, a different part of our community. Think for a moment about one transformation that your organization could make. I'm giving you 30 seconds. It's happening now. This could be anything. It doesn't have to be something that you think your organization would necessarily do, right? But something that you as a leader or you as a staff member of an organization or a board member of an organization thinks might be viable. Okay, that's 30 seconds. Now, for a minute, open a window on your computer or grab a pen and just write for a minute. And I want you to think specifically about how you think this move would be perceived by your board, or perceived by your staff, or perceived by your community. I want you to write about that for 1 minute. Would your board be excited to do something like this? How about your staff? How would it affect your community on a regular basis? Just give it some thought. It's okay if the answers aren't matching up the way you hoped. That's part of the point. Great. So that's a minute. Now, put that down for a second. And I want you to think of this question. What do we feel when we hear that a nonprofit is changing their focus? That they're merging, that they're closing, shrinking, moving, changing. I want you to write the first words that pop into your mind into the chat. If you've got 3 words, give me 3 words. What comes to mind? What feelings come up? Thank you. Thank you for the people who are doing it. Yeah. Yeah. What do we think of? Any others? Okay. This is great. So I'm going to start naming out some of them. Loss, scared, excited, rebirth, support, responsive, too much change, not supporting members, couldn't make it, excited. These are all great. These are great responses. What can change those responses? What can change us from feeling like something like this is a loss to something like this is a success? What are the ways that we can start thinking about life cycle change in a more positive set of terms? Rather than couldn't make it, how do we say made the changes that were necessary? Rather than saying too much change, say change is constant. How can we change the way we feel about transforming our nonprofits? I want you to continue to type into the chat and think about these. How can we change the way we feel about transforming our nonprofits? I've been a nonprofit leader. Many of you are nonprofit leaders. When you hear about change, you feel empathy, right? You're like, oh, those leaders must be struggling. How can we say, oh, that this is an opportunity, perhaps, for our organization? Yeah, I'm getting more responses here that I want to read out. Transparency, you know, how do we change those? We're transparent about what we need, right? Wanting to meet the need of our community. Progressive growth. Having an organization that's open to feedback. Knowing that change can help. I've got one for you. I've got one which is my big one. This is my big one. This is what I think we really need to do to change the way we feel about transforming our nonprofits. We need to normalize it. And this is a big picture normalization. We need our boards. We need our foundations. We need our donors. We need our funders. We need our staffs to normalize change, significant transformational change. If we think we might need to amalgamate or merge or change or back-end partner with someone, instead of seeing this as a failure and going to our board and saying we're in dire need, let's have resources available to us in the community and to our board and to our organization to be able to start to have these conversations in progressive ways rather than there's a fire and we have to put it out. How can we build funding for this kind of work? How can we build mentors and mentees for this kind of work? People that have gone through these changes and understand these changes. How do we encourage our foundations to, rather than be our saviors in moments like this, and we go to them and say, oh, we have to merge, we have to close, and then they say, oh, we're here for you, which is wonderful and powerful, and we're thankful for that. But rather than that, how about they have a program already in place where we can call them and say, we're considering a merger, and they send $25,000 our way so that we can hire the lawyer we need or the consultant we need, or just pay our staff better while they're going through these conversations with another organization. We need donors that understand that these kinds of life cycle changes are normal and they need to support us through them. We need corporate funders and other funders in our community and our community partners to be supportive of these changes. But I leave to the last conversation the board of directors, because this is where our challenges lie for a lot of nonprofit leaders, is that there is a disconnect in some way between the long-term plans of the executive staff and the long-term plans of the board of directors. My organization has done a case study of organizations that received funding through a program in actually Calgary in Alberta to make these kinds of changes, to do life cycle changes. And in almost all cases, the board of directors was pointed out as a barrier to the desire of the executive staff in whatever change they were making. And many of the reasons that were given when I spoke to board members and when I spoke to staff members were centered around a fear of being seen as a failure, or have been, particularly in board leadership, not wanting to have been the leader when the organization had to make a change like that. Not concerned about the best interests of the organization necessarily, but concerned about their own issues. I'm not saying this is with every board. We know there are wonderful boards, there are fantastic boards, there are good boards, there are bad boards, there's everything. So I'm not saying this is across the board, but I am saying that when change like this happens, it becomes personal for people. Perhaps you're a founder of an organization. If your organization had to merge or had to change or had to close, what feelings does that bring up for you as a founder? That can be a daunting psychological task to go through, to try to understand how you might shut your organization down as a founder of an organization, or how you might merge your organization and leave the leadership. We have a couple of issues, and I talk about them in one of the white papers that my team has written, and I'll give you a link to it. Is we have a couple of issues that we deal with in leadership, and one of them is ego. Obviously, we have leaders in the board and leaders in the staff, leaders at foundations, our donors, who have healthy egos, and those egos stop us sometimes from making the decisions that are actually best for our community. We're concerned about what the perception might be in our professional community rather than the actual community that we're serving. And then we have what I call the fallacy of singularity. And this is something that pervades certain portions of the nonprofit world more than others. My work in the social justice areas and in the arts area have shown me that it's very prevalent in those areas, that there is a sense that no one else does what we do, how we do it, as well as we do it. And I think we all know, as leaders in the nonprofit world, there's a significant amount of overlap in what we do. And that's the point, that there's overlapping services available for our communities. But when we start to feel like we are singular and we couldn't possibly merge or close or change because we're too essential, that's actually a barrier to change. It's not a good thing. So we see those two things pretty significantly in leadership when there's discussions around these kinds of transformational changes. So if you want to find more information about Lifecycle and about transformation, I have some information on my website, which I'm going to send you towards, and there's a couple of other podcasts and blogs that I'm going to recommend. But there's an immense amount of work being done in this area in this moment in the nonprofit world. And I think what's exciting is that there's a lot of openness among those that are doing it to sharing the information that we're gleaning. A lot of the information that I currently have on my site might be helpful to people who are looking at models for mergers or amalgamations, or models for change of service to community. We've done a number of studies on that. So I'm going to list a couple of resources here, and then I'm going to take any questions that you have, because I just threw out a lot of information in 16 minutes. So I appreciate the opportunity to do it. These are documents that we wrote for the arts and culture community, focused on the pandemic effect to the arts. I think they have value in all nonprofit communities. Cultural Triage was talking about the immediate need for the arts community being funders normalizing change, because arts organizations obviously couldn't perform for 2 years. We wrote then a response internally to our own piece through a BIPOC lens. This speaks to the different challenges that predominantly white organizations have versus BIPOC organizations when it comes to the sort of nuance around support for strategic development and change. And what you'll find if you read them is that BIPOC organizations have been making the kind of change that predominantly white organizations are now just beginning to tap into, but BIPOC organizations have been making that change for decades. I recommend this CBC radio interview with David Maggs. Where do the arts go from here? Again, this is arts focused, but he speaks pretty intensely about the ecology of the nonprofit world, which I think is super valuable. And then as somebody who works with arts organizations, I'm always recommending to my nonprofit clients that they have artists in the room when they talk about this work, because I think the creativity of artists is really important. And Shannon Litzenberger really speaks to the importance of artists being part of all communities in this moment, all nonprofit communities, healthcare, social justice, social service, really engaging themselves in that work and bringing the creativity that artists have into those roles. So that's my presentation. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, I'd love to answer any, or be happy to respond to any other thoughts.
Brian, while we wait for our attendees to post any questions, one of the most common questions we get is, when would you recommend an organization seek outside help in evaluating its current structure, and how can it evolve to meet the needs of a changing community? So when should an organization look for outside help?
Yeah, I think there's, unfortunately, in many cases, there are limited resources out there when you're looking to make significant change. But I do feel that organizations, once they have any internal forward motion on some kind of change, need to get voices from the outside. I would look in your community to other organizations that have gone through potentially similar changes. Like if there was a big merger in your community of some nonprofits, find one of the leaders of those organizations to talk to. I recommend a number of these resources and reaching out to consultants who have specifically done this kind of change work. There's more and more of them now in the US and in Canada as well. So I think there's opportunities to reach out to them. And then I would also recommend even a facilitator to come in and facilitate sort of open discussion around the future potential of the organization, as if you were beginning a strategic planning process, but you're not, right? You're just opening up the door to, hey, this is what we're seeing and we may need to change our path, you know, and have a facilitated discussion between board staff and your community. That's the key. Bring in the community members. They'll tell you what they want. That has always been my experience.
Great, and maybe you just answered this, but our first attendee question is, do you think this work needs external consultants or can it be driven by internal staff?
Oh, I think it's both. You know, I have seen full mergers happen without a single consultant or lawyer hired in any form, and they've gone really well. It really depends on the leadership of the organization. I found that organizations where there is not 100% buy-in from board, staff, and community, having some facilitation of that process can be really helpful. If you need you may need help communicating it effectively to your community or communicating it effectively to your board, what your goals are. But if there's internal anonymity around change and the leaders on the board and staff have the skills to be able to do it, I'm very, excited at organizations that have that capacity to be able to do that work in addition to the work that they're already doing. But if that's not viable, then I always recommend bringing in someone to assist with these conversations. I would also always invite, people from the thought community into your conversations if you are doing it yourself. If you're doing it yourself, invite a couple of consultants in for an hour or 2 hours to give you another viewpoint on your situation. I always recommend getting as many viewpoints as you can before you decide on any change. What you see in your own bubble may be different than what's going to be most effective for your community.
Thank you. Our next question is, how can you help with change if your leadership is not comfortable with change?
Yeah, that's where resources really come in handy. And this is something that I'm hoping to take on next in our sort of research practice, is start to build some resources around this area. You know, if you're finding difficulty in having conversations with other leaders and other board members and funders around change in your organization, having someone who's gone through this change to talk to and has had to have these difficult conversations can be really helpful. There are a number of books and articles out there around board, if it's a board issue or a staff issue. There are a number of books and other things that can talk about different strategies around bringing your organization around to change. But in the end, it does require coming to some kind of agreement for the organization. You can't go forward without that. And oftentimes a consultant or a coach may be very helpful in that process. You know, if you can bring someone in at that point and be able to say, can you help us facilitate a solution here that will work for this whole team?
Thank you. And our last question is, can you share a little more about the difference in organizations based on culture?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Sure. Can you share a little more about the difference in organizations based on culture?
I'm going to make an assumption that the difference in organizations based on internal culture is what I'm going to sort of like, is what we're talking about, like the culture of the organization. But I think the difference, so I don't want to open up a whole can of worms here, but organizational structure is part of this discussion in regards to transformation, right? We have top-down organizations in the nonprofit world, the same as we have in the corporate world. And I think that when serving community, that's not always the best solution. For some organization, it works very well. For others, it doesn't. In many nonprofits, we have many positions that have no relationship to the community that we serve, right? And that we have programmed staff who actually serve our community directly. And so oftentimes, if we have a culture that is separated like that, that you have an administrative culture and a programmatic culture, that these kinds of transformations can be extremely difficult if you don't have deep connections between your administrative culture and your programmatic culture. Because the programmers are frankly often paid at a lower level than some of the administrators, and they serve the community directly and feel like they have the bird's eye view on what they want. And administrators have the best interest of the organization as a whole in mind, but if there's not a direct pipeline from programming to administration, often these kinds of changes can even be more difficult and more affecting and cause, negative impacts to staffing and community connection. Where I find the most success with our internal cultures that are already based on like sharing at all levels and good communication. If organizations have good communication structures, if there's good transparency and sharing between board, staff, and community, then these kinds of changes can feel very normal to them, that we're going to shift our model to serve you better. So yeah, and if I got the question wrong, Michael, please feel free to reach out to me and I can re-answer the question the way you intended it. So thanks.
Thank you, Brian. That was our last question for now. This workshop has now come to a close. If you are interested in receiving the recordings and materials from today's free webinar, you can visit our free webinars page on the Nonprofit Learning Lab website, or you can send us an email at program@nonprofitlearninglab.org. Thank you so much for participating. And again, thank you, Brian, for educating our community.
Thank you. Have a great day, everyone.